Welcome back to Indus Special. Now, governments around the world have increasingly become more critical of social media platforms and the role they play during acts of violence and their harmful contributions following deadly attacks, such as the spread of fake news. Several crackdown measures have not only been proposed, but have also been imposed, such as the social media ban in Sri Lanka following the Easter bombings. We take a closer look at the importance of these measures. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. John Stachelski, who is a social media expert joining us from Moscow. We're also joined by Mr. Matthew Bunker, who is a global security expert joining us from London. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Matthew, let me begin with you. Give us a sense of how crime, violence, and extremism is organized over social media platforms. What are some of the trends that have been witnessed and observed?
Well, the first thing that social media is really used for initially is to, in larger groups, when we look at terrorist organisations, is to really recruit the people to conduct the acts. And the other way that social media is used is once that act is then committed, it's used as the platform to spread that as fear out to everyone else around the globe.
Yeah. And with that organization, how do you think individuals themselves spread their messages of violence? And how do you think they escape the radar of these social media platforms that want to crack down on hate speech?
Look, I actually think that the social media platforms themselves have fairly loose rules when it comes to monitoring these types of events. If you look at the terrorist attack in Christchurch recently, videos of that attack showing the deaths of people, the violent deaths of people, were able to be uploaded and streamed across the globe via Facebook. So it's more the authorities that seem to be clamping down on the social media networks that are allowing these types of acts to be uploaded.
Yeah. And with that, Mr. John, let me ask you, we see in the world of social media that everyone has immense freedom to express their thoughts, and there are various ways to do that, live streaming and several others. Now, with and after Christchurch and several other attacks, how do you think that freedom needs to reconcile with security measures?
Sure. I think that one of the serious problems that we have when talking about these social media sites is that there's this presumption that they're functioning as some kind of neutral network where everyone's just allowed to express themselves, and therefore there's no single ideological trend that goes along with it. But we have to remember that these are massive companies, and they're not beholden to the communities in which they're operating. So in Sri Lanka, perhaps their goals match up with the population in some instances, but ultimately they care about their shareholders. And so those are the people that they're ultimately answering to. And even if they have a local group, those people are beholden to, some person sitting in Silicon Valley that has no connection to the tragedies that are unfolding across the world. So I think that we always need to keep in mind that we can't presume these companies to just be a neutral platform.
Yeah. And with that, more and more politicians and governments want to hold social media platforms accountable for this lapse in judgment or their policies which are triggering violence and allowing violence. Now, what do you think with this pressure after these attacks, especially in Christchurch, do you think that these platforms will bring about meaningful reforms?
I don't think that these platforms will bring about meaningful reform unless they're forced to. And it's an unfortunate thing, but it's impossible to imagine that a company is going to regulate itself, especially when it stands to gain from, if Facebook is hosting instances of this video and it's in the news, people are going to click on that video and they're going to get more ad revenue, and there's no reason for them to actually clamp down. So though I know Facebook said that they had eliminated like 1,500,000 instances of uploads of the video immediately in the aftermath of the attack, but ultimately groups around the world felt like they hadn't done enough. And I know that the French Muslim Council, for instance, sued them actually for hosting the video, and in a way where children could actually easily access it, and perhaps even by accident, because it was all over the news and being shared on so many sites. So I think that, as you said earlier, that the only way that this has actually been clamped down on is when governments or people that are actually beholden to that local population start making them do so.
Yeah. And Mr. Matthew, do you think that when governments intervene, as Mr. John has stated there very strongly, that it's only when governments would intervene that these platforms would be forced to take action? But do you think there are problems with governments intervening? Now, we've heard of a social media ban in Sri Lanka, and we talked to our guests earlier, and they felt that this ban really had no use except for the fact that the government was projecting an image of being in control. So do you think when the government intervenes like this, it might not always do good?
Look, I think there's really both sides of the argument have validity here. I think when there is a crisis or an incident, a terrorist incident as large as Sri Lanka, or as on show as the attacks in Christchurch were, I think there's reason enough for governments and authorities to step in and stop the streaming of these violent acts, because that's exactly what the terrorists want. The people that commit these crimes, they want to get this out there. And social media is an easy platform to be able to achieve that. So I think, yes, authorities should have the ability to regulate that with social media, but there becomes a fine line where you then overstep that and you start encroaching on people's free right for speech, and just freedom of action.
So who do you think would decide between what that fine line is and when not to step beyond it?
Look, I think this might sound silly to say, but, you elect politicians into those positions. We, as, most free countries, elect the politicians. So I suppose you have to have trust in your government, in your elected officials, in your security forces, your police, whether that's domestic or federally, that they are making the right decisions, and they're making a decision that's best for the population at that point in time.
Yeah. And with that point, I'd like to go to a point that Mr. John mentioned earlier, which was that the business models of these social media platforms wouldn't allow them to make meaningful reforms. Now, Mr. John, give us a sense of how in the world this is becoming a threat. The social media platforms' business models is infringing upon people's security and safety.
Yeah, I think we would have to look at, there's several specific instances that we can talk about, and they're actually quite different, but they all have something in common. If we can look at the situation in Sri Lanka, or what happened in Christchurch, or we could actually look at a situation that might seem different on the surface, but is actually related, which would be the situation in Venezuela, where immediately following Juan Guaido's call for a coup, the government imposed a social media crackdown, or allegedly did so. And this, in some ways, allowed them to not have to act in such a way that Juan Guaido would not be able to call out to the broader population to basically overthrow the government. And in this case, I think that we could say that any government on earth would do so. We could criticize this as an act of censorship, but at the same time, China has had a sovereign internet for some time, and Russia recently restructured their internet. So in the case of, this kind of informational warfare, they would be able to sort of lock down and take care of a crisis situation. And regardless of what side we think of this morally, it's something that I think any government on earth is going to do in order to protect itself in a crisis situation.
Yeah, and Mr. John, it seems that as of the social media sites, at least Facebook, when Mark Zuckerberg wrote an op-ed saying that he wants governments to take control and he wants governments to make Facebook accountable for when there are lapses in their policies. Do you think that was a complete optics as well?
I'm not sure about a complete optic, but I definitely believe that this is part of his advertising himself as a person that's accountable and trying to present himself as someone who's his line is, I'm aware of the problems that my website has, and I'm totally here and ready to listen to all of these complaints and restructure. But in terms of how that is actually going to translate into meaningful action, I'm very doubtful of that.
Yeah, right. And Mr. Matthew Bunker, just a question to you. What do you think are the future dangers if governments don't intervene and don't take control of the situation? Do you think that in the future, hate speech will just escalate, even though there seems to be in mainstream media this realization that there needs to be better measures taken to counter it and people should be made more aware?
Yes, definitely. I think social media networks, particularly when there's an incident, need to be held more accountable for the information that's being broadcast out there. For the simple reason is that it is exactly what the terrorists want, or the person that committed the violent act. It's exactly what they want. They want what they did out there, and they want it out there fast, and they want it out there for propaganda reasons so they can recruit more people. I think if governments keep doing what they're doing in shutting these social media networks down at those current point in time, my personal view is I think they're actually doing a justice for the community.
Yeah. And on that point, Mr. Hugh, I'd like to thank you for joining us and talking to us. Thank you so much, Mr. John, for talking to us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Goodbye and take care.